do is just go over a few things with you about the Russian Revolution. I know you've been reading from the World War I chapter about the Russian Revolution, and now I just want to go over some notes. It won't be real fancy. I want to go over this Russian Revolution. So here it is, this Russian Revolution. Now the background is you have the Tsar, Nicholas II. He's the last of this family, the Romanovs. They've been in there for 300 years. The Russian state is following an absolute monarchy still. Now, you guys, if you remember, we typically teach this concept of absolutism in October. We're now in April. We're getting into May almost. So some states followed absolutism back like in the fall, so hundreds of years ago, and we're still in it in the 20th century. So Russia holds on to absolutism. They hold it on longer than any other European state. Although I got to tell you, some countries are still absolutists today. So you kind of want to, it's not a dead type of government. It's just people have moved away from absolutism as a form of government. So here we have Nicholas. Now, Nicholas, if you remember, the beginning of World War I is related to the leader of England and the leader of Germany. Here he is with his family, his wife and his four daughters and one son. Of course, the son is the key to the family because he's the heir to the throne. Unfortunately for little Alexei, he has hemophilia. And of course, hemophilia is a genetic thing. It's passed to the boy, the heir to the throne. Here he is with his cousin George V, the King of England at the eve of World War I. And they're in their finery, their royal outfits, their military uniforms, dress uniforms, I'd say. Now, the Russian state on the eve of World War I, we want to think at the top who, the financiers, the people running the government are going to expose their money. The clergy will pray for you, and the clergy would reflect this Russian Orthodox Church, which is a branch of Christianity. And you have the bourgeoisie, or the fat cats, in there eating on their behalf, and who will shoot at you will be the soldiers, and who will work for them. The people in the bottom are all the peasants or serfs, the workers of the Russian state. So this is really a great cartoon talking about the hierarchy of the Russian state. Russia is slow to industrialize. This factory picture here is an interesting depiction, but it's probably at least 100 years behind the English state. The English have been industrializing for at least 150 years. Other European states industrialize at different rates. But of course, on the eve of World War I, Germany has surpassed or jumps in front of England. Now, Russia is really just slow to industrialize here. We want to kind of keep that in mind also. Now, this is a great propaganda poster going back to the revolution of 1905, trying to tie it to 1917. And we didn't cover the revolution of 1905. You don't need to know that. But the red, that's going to be symbolic of the communist state, our precursor here, which is what it says on the bottom there. The communists will argue the support for their revolution goes back in history in the Russian state. So let's talk about Russia and World War I. They initially had great success. They're on the side of the Allies with France, or that triple entente with France and Great Britain. They're enthusiastic, as all of the states are in World War I. They hope to be home by Christmas. And there was great hope among the Russian people they'd have a better state. Russia suffers terrible casualties as the war progresses. By 1915, 2 million casualties a year. Casualties is wounded or killed in action. The Russian soldiers don't have enough equipment. They're told to pick up a weapon as they go up towards the front from someone dying, or they simply share a weapon. The Tsar will actually leave home to lead his troops, which is admirable, it sounds like, in 1916. But he leaves at home his wife, the Tsarina, and she comes under this influence by this Rasputin, who's in a whole other funny story. But the Tsar goes to lead his troops in the war, which is an admirable thing, but it leaves the Russian state quite weak and vulnerable. And so by 1917, the state is disintegrating. Casualties of course, soaring. Now we're going to have a phenomenal changes happen in Russia. And we say there's revolutions in Russia. There's one in the spring and one in the fall. Now I have the words up here, February, March, and October, November. I think I use typically the March-November revolution. Why are there two different dates? Because the Orthodox Christians follow a calendar. I believe they follow the Gregorian calendar. I think Christians today, the United States, we follow a Julian calendar. So it's a slight difference of the days. But there's a revolution in the spring and there's a revolution in the fall. Many argue the revolution in the spring of 1917, February, March, when they get rid of the Tsar and they don't really have a government. Many would argue Russia's the freest state in the world, and they probably are. In the spring of 1917, they are, because the rest of the countries, if you're involved with the war, they have a very controlled economy. Even our own country, we had a restricted press. Um, we just didn't have as much freedom as the Russians will have initially in 1917. Now, you've worked through the revolution, but I really want to go through these dates. And I don't get too particular, but in March of 1917, with the initial revolution, you want to understand that the people in Petrograd. Now, Petrograd is the capital of Russia. Petrograd had been called St. Petersburg. We call it then Petrograd because St. Petersburg sounded too much like a German word, because Petersburg, the Berg, B-U-R-G, is a German word. So as the Tsar is at the front, we have bread demonstrations spontaneously breaking out in Petrograd. The workers are clashing with the police, the industrial workers, right? The workers of the city, we're going to also call them, they'll be part of the thing called Soviets. Within 2 days, the strike spread to other people. They destroyed a police station. And the Petrograd Soviets have formed. In the capital of St. Petersburg, or Petrograd, the Soviet. Now, the Soviet's a council of workers. Now, the troops are called in. The military is called in to break up this, bread demonstration. But they will not move against the workers. And this is a real problem for the Tsar. If your king or leader doesn't have the support of the military, you've lost power here. So when the Petrograd garrison, the Petrograd army is called in to put down, whether it's the military or the army, doesn't matter. When the garrison's called in and they won't move against the workers, they won't stop the workers, they're actually going to join, they defect to join the demonstrators. Power is going to be gone. Now the Duma, I wrote here, the Duma is dissolved. The Duma is an elected assembly, like a parliament, Congress. So the Petrograd police are called in. They won't move against the workers. And by the next day, they defect to join the demonstrators. The government resigns. The Tsar will resign. He tried to get his brother to take the throne, and smart guy doesn't take the throne. But the Tsar will resign. He'll give up his post. Then the legislative body, which in Russia we're going to call it a Duma, they form a provisional government. Now, this is a big word, I think. Provisional, it just means a temporary government. But the provisional government is going to compete for power with the Petrograd Soviet. Now, if you remember, just a few days earlier, the Petrograd Soviet was formed. These workers who were demanding changes just on March 10th. So we don't want to forget about this Petrograd Soviet. And this is a little complicated for most people, so don't panic yet. The next day, the Petrograd Soviet says they issue Order Number 1. And Petrograd Order Number 1 said to the soldiers they didn't have to listen to their superiors in the military. They didn't have to listen to the officers. But Petrograd Order Number 1 will undermine authority in the Russian army. The Tsar has abdicated his throne then by the 15th, and things progress in Russia. So, as I mentioned, who wants power? Well, this provisional government actually has the power, but the Petrograd Soviet is competing with the provisional government for power. You do have other factions, 3-4 other major political groups. You have Bolsheviks, you have Mensheviks, and Social Democrats. We're not going to worry about them. What all you and I want to worry about is this provisional government has the power. It's headed up by a guy named Kerensky. The Petrograd Soviet has some power in the city of Petrograd. It's a council of workers. And then we have this other small group called the Bolsheviks, who will become a communist. So in the spring of 1917, the provisional government has power. By the end of 1917, the Bolsheviks will assume power. And the Petrograd Soviet's always vying for power in between here. Now, the Bolsheviks end up being led by Vladimir Lenin. He had been exiled in the early 1900s by the Tsar. I believe his brother had assassinated a high-ranking member of the royal family. Lenin is granted passage back into Russia by the Germans. And this is all done purposely because the Germans want to have a change of government there. The Germans are clearly beating the Russians, but they're hoping they could see this infighting coming about in Russia, and they want to see, Germany wants Russia out of the war. Because remember, Germany's fighting a two-front war in World War I against the Russians, and then the French Belgians, the Brits, and the trenches over the Western Front. Now, Lenin's really attracted to the people. Now, and the Bolsheviks have a strong showing. They don't have a majority of the people. Lenin offers a really simple slogan he doesn't deviate from it: land, peace, and bread. And it's a great slogan. It's easy to follow, it's easy to understand. He wants land reform to the peasants. He wants peace, that's end World War I. And bread is getting food to the people. Okay, so you've been in the war since 1914, 1915, in the fourth year of the war. There's already a state that's struggling. So his slogan of land, peace, and bread makes him attractive to the peasants of Russia. And you add to that the genius of Leon Trotsky. So his name is Leon Trotsky. He's a military leader and he's a great orator. So Trotsky and Lenin together will become this fierce force. Now, not right away, but by the end of 1917, these two will take power. Lenin's attracted to the people for his easy slogans and his support of Trotsky, but the provisional government kind of shoots itself in the foot. And how does it do that? It continues the war. Okay, the Russian people were tired of the war. Army Order Number 1 actually undermined the war when it said to the peasant soldiers they didn't have to listen to their officers because they were nobles. So the provisional government attempted like a final surge, final push in the war to do something positive, and it doesn't work. So the war is not popular with the people, and they're not real successful. As 1917 continues in the city of Petrograd, the sailors will mutiny. Trotsky will infiltrate the Soviets, the Council of Workers in Petrograd, and then the Bolsheviks literally overnight seize power of the physical structure. Now, Kerensky had been the head of the Bolsheviks, and Kerensky is actually able to get out of the city with his life, and he actually escapes to the United States where he lives. But the Bolsheviks seize power the night of November 6th to 7th, 1917. A secret police force is formed, which will continue in Russia probably even to this day. But the Russians are known for their secret police force. By the spring of 1918, the Bolsheviks will sign a peace treaty ending the war with Germany. When they do this, they're willing to give up a lot of stuff. They give up land, they give up the people, but the land was like their breadbasket. And they moved the capital from St. Petersburg or Petrograd to Moscow. Once they get out of World War I, what happens in Russia is a bloody civil war. And as an American, we've had our own civil war in the 1860s, but the civil war here is, we're going to refer to the Reds and the Whites. Now, the Reds, the word red refers to Bolsheviks or communists, which means today. And that's still a term used today. Someone's a red or commie might be a phrase you heard of. So the Bolsheviks are led by Lenin and Trotsky. The Whites are supporters of the Tsar. And the British, the French, the Americans are loaning lots of aid to the Whites. But the Whites are not unified, and the Whites are going to fail. The Reds will win. So what does it take to win the Civil War? Well, the Bolsheviks are willing to use terror for winning the war, and they also implement something called war communism. When they take over everything for the good of the war effort, they seize things physically for the good of the war effort. The peasants, the mines, the factories, the banks. By 1922, the Civil War is probably 1918, about 1920, 21, they come up with a constitution that formally declared the USSR. The USSR stands for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And Soviet goes back to that group from 1917 that was vying for power, or this Council of Workers. Lenin leads the way here. He's the brains behind it. He's the first leader. Unfortunately for Lenin, he only lasted a couple years in power, and his untimely death in 1924 will move into the spotlight then his successor. And his successor, should it be Trotsky? Should it be Stalin is a great question.